Good. This is a tight historical question, and I'll answer it cleanly, exhaustively, and without spin. Below are all known individuals, real named people, not anonymous texts, in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries who explicitly name Matthew, Mark, Luke, and/or John as gospel authors outside the Bible with exact wording or faithful ancient summaries and precise sources. I will not include anonymous documents unless clearly attributed by ancient testimony, people who only use gospels without naming authors, or later medieval writers. If a figure does not name an author, they are excluded. 1st, 3rd century external testimony. Naming the gospel authors. 1. Papias of Hierapolis, date c. 130 AD, early 2nd century. Status, Bishop of Hierapolis. Source quoted by Eusebius, Church History 3.39. What Papias says. On Mark, open quote, Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately everything that he remembered of the things said or done by the Lord, though not in order. Hist, Eccl 3.39.15, close quote. On Matthew, open quote, Matthew composed the logia in the Hebrew language, and each one interpreted them as he was able. 16, close quote. Names. Matthew and Mark explicitly does not mention Luke or John. Earliest known attribution in Christian history. 2. Irenaeus of Lyons. Date c. 1775 to 190 AD, late century. Status, Bishop, disciple of Polycarp. Source, Against Heresies 3.11. What Irenaeus says, open quote, Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect, while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, handed down to us in writing what Peter had preached. Luke also, the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who had leaned on his breast, himself published a gospel while living at Ephesus in Asia, close quote. Names all 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. First surviving writer to name all 4 together. Now, 3. Theophilus of Antioch, date c. 180 AD, status, Bishop of Antioch. Source to Autolycus 2.22, what Theophilus says, open quote, and hence the holy writings teach us, and all the inspired men, one of whom John says, in the beginning was the Word, close quote, explicitly names John as gospel author, does not mention the synoptics. 4. Clement of Alexandria, date c. 180 to 200 AD, status, head of the Catechetical School of Alexandria. Source, quoted by Eusebius, Church History 6.45 to 7. What Clement says. Open quote, the Gospels containing the genealogies were written first. Mark and Luke were written next. John, last of all, conscious that the outward facts had been set forth in the Gospels, composed a spiritual gospel, close quote. Explicitly names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Confirms order and authorship tradition. Tertullian of Carthage, date c. 200 to 220 AD, early 3rd century. Status, presbyter and theologian. Source, Against Marcion 4.2, what Tertullian says. Open quote, we lay it down as our first position that the Evangelical Testament has apostles for its authors. Of the apostles, John and Matthew. Of apostolic men, Luke and Mark. Close quote. Explicitly names all 4 distinguishes apostles' apostolic companions. Number 6, Origen of Alexandria. Date c. 230 to 250 AD, early mid-3rd century. Status, biblical scholar. Source, quoted by Eusebius, Church History 6.25.4. What Origen says, open quote, the first gospel was written by Matthew, the second by Mark, who composed it according to the instructions of Peter, the third by Luke, praised by Paul, last of all, that by John. Close quote. Explicitly names all 4. Most detailed early scholarly summary. Hippolytus of Rome. Date, c. 220 to 235 AD. Status, presbyter, theologian. Source, fragments, on the 12 apostles, attributed. What Hippolytus says, summary from fragments. Matthew wrote for Hebrew believers. Mark wrote from Peter's preaching. Luke from Paul. John while at Ephesus. Names all 4. Closely follows Irenaean tradition. Who is not included, important. These do not explicitly name authors, so they are excluded. Justin Martyr uses Memoirs of the Apostles, no names. Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp, Didache, 1 Clement, Tatian. Fourfold Gospel, no names. Anonymous. Anti-Marcionite Prologues, anonymous. Complete list. Person, century, names. Given. Papias, 2nd Mark. Irenaeus, 2nd Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Theophilus, Clement of Alexandria. Second, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. John, Tertullian. Third, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Origen, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Hippolytus, third, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. This is the full data set. No one else in the first 3rd centuries explicitly names the gospel authors.